Good afternoon and welcome. I am Nicole Austin Hillary. I'm the Director and Counsel of the Washington office of the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm so pleased to see you all here this afternoon for what I'm sure will be a robust and what we know is already a very important discussion on candid cameras, the impact of body cameras on privacy, law enforcement, and community policing. We know we are at an extremely important moment at this time in our country with the intersection of law enforcement, race, politics, constitutional rights. And we know that it is an important moment for those of us in the advocacy community to be thought leaders on these issues. So we are very pleased to be hosting this conversation today. This conversation was really the brainchild of my colleague, Rachel Levinson-Waldman, whom you'll meet in a little bit, who's one of the panelists. Rachel is part of our Liberty and National Security program here at the Brennan Center. And for those of you who are not as familiar with us and what we do, the Brennan Center is a national legal advocacy think tank strategic communications organization. I know that's a mouthful. And we like to do what we call fix the broken parts of our systems of democracy and justice. So we work on issues as far-ranging as the liberty and national security issues dealing with policing, privacy, civil liberties and civil rights, as well as voting rights, fair courts, money in politics, and issues of justice with respect to our criminal justice system. And we use those tools of advocacy, litigation, research, and advocacy to, again, try to fix those broken systems in democracy and justice. So as part of that work, we host conversations like this where we try to engage you, interested individuals and stakeholders whom we know can be a part of our efforts to make reforms and to basically problem solve. So again, thank you for being with us this afternoon. I am going to quickly introduce our moderator for today's discussion, and then she will take it away and begin the conversation with our panelists. We will be joined today, and we are happy to be joined today by Tanzina Vega. Tanzina is a digital correspondent for CNN Politics, where she covers the intersection of technology, politics, and civil rights. Prior to beginning her work at CNN, Tanzina was a staff reporter for the New York Times, where she covered digital media and advertising for the business section, race and ethnicity for the national section, and the New York City courts for the metro section. She was also a web producer for the Times and joined the paper in 2006 as a news clerk and a stringer. She began her career at CMP Media, where she worked on which is a technology and trade magazine publisher, where she was a research editor and helped pioneer the company's first podcast. One of the things about Tanzina's background that I'm particularly impressed with as an NPR junkie, as I'm sure many of you are in this room, but NPR's Code Switch included Tanzina in their Journalists of Color to Watch in 2014 list. And the Huffington Post listed Tanzina as one of the 40 top Latinos in American media. So we are pleased to have Tanzina help us with this very important discussion today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks to everyone for being here today. Before we introduce the panel, I just got back from Camden, New Jersey, which used to be one of the most dangerous cities in America. In addition to the surveillance cameras and the audio recorders and the license plate readers, that the department is also about to deploy more than 300 body cameras in September. Crime rates in the city as a result have been drastically reduced through what officials say is a combination of technology and old school policing. But Camden is not alone. We live in a world of video everywhere, from YouTube to cell phones, where we are inundated with a constant stream of media. And the power to create media is now in the hands of citizens. Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray are just a few of the names of the victims of police brutality that may have otherwise gone unnoticed had it not been for someone recording or snapping a photo on their cell phone. Many police departments around the country are realizing that they too want to record video to increase transparency, respond to calls for accountability, and to also protect themselves. But the solutions are not that simple, and today's panel will help us to unpack some of the complexities involved with implementing this emerging technology. So I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Jay Stanley, who is a senior policy analyst at the ACLU. Next to Jay, we have Jim Bierman, president of the Police Foundation. Next to Jim, we have Andrea Ritchie, a senior policy counsel of Streetwise and Safe. And at the end of the row, last but not least, Rachel Levinson-Waldman, senior counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. Thank you all for being here today. So To start off, I think it helps to talk a little bit about the scope of body cameras and the penetration of body cameras. Does anyone have a sense for how many body cameras are out there, what the percentages are? I mean, it's just something that we hear called for consistently, but I think it's hard to sort of give a scope to some of our listeners and readers today. Where are we with that? And how long before we actually get to full penetration of body cameras in the United States? Anyway.
Well, the last surveys that I saw, which may be about a year or more old, suggested that about 25% of the 17,000 or so police departments in the U.S., about 25% of them had some or were looking at had some body cameras at least, and that 80% of the departments were considering adopting them. So, but we know that uptake of this technology has been happening very quickly, and I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 or 15 or 20 years, it becomes a standard piece of equipment on every uniformed police officer.
Mm-hmm. So we're definitely heading in that direction, it seems. What are some of the examples where this is working? I mean, there are some cities and states that have implemented body cameras that seem to have more success than others. I'll throw a couple of examples. Seattle, perhaps, has implemented. I think it's held up as one of the most forward-thinking, perhaps. Los Angeles, Texas. There are different areas that have had sort of mixed reactions. What would you all say are some areas that should be held up as positive examples or good examples where this is working, and some that might be a little bit less?
I think it's important to ask the question, what do you mean by it's working, right? So because how we perceive this issue is dependent, I think, in large part on where we stand on the issue. So I'm from Southern California. That's where my policing career was. And a community near my hometown, the Rialto Police Department, is often quoted as a place that did their own randomized controlled trial with those body cameras, which has its own, I think, remarkable attributes that a police department on its own would try to do a rigorous trial of these things. And in that department, they found dramatic decreases in officers' use of force and complaints. So if those are the metrics that we want to use, that is highly suggestive that that's working. And I think there have been other studies that may not have had the same kind of numbers, but certainly had decreases in officer use of force and complaints. And so as we think about that on some 5,000-foot level, that sounds like a great thing, and I would submit that it is. What we don't know conclusively is why that's happening. Why did those numbers go down? Is it because the cameras, there's nothing magical about these little boxes that cops wear. They're just a little thing, right? They could have done this a long time ago. So is there a civilizing effect that occurs when officers wear those because both they and if they tell the person they're interacting with they're wearing the body camera, is it the same kind of phenomena that occurs when we were kids and we knew our parents were watching what we're doing, or we're in a classroom and we know if the teacher's looking at us, we're going to behave better? Is it something as simple as that, or is there something much more complex going on that relates to other kinds of transparency and accountability? And I don't think we know, but certainly the places you cited, Seattle, I think as we speak now is finishing a summit on body cameras, and they certainly have pushed the envelope in terms of things like transparency. So if that's how you and privacy issues, if that's how you measure success for them, I would hold them up because they're pushing out the images, not in real time, but pretty close to it on their YouTube channel that are blurred as a way of kind of massive redaction of and protecting people's privacy. And so I think people should pay a lot of attention to what they're up to right now, because when you begin to, as you said earlier, unpack this issue, you find that there are so many issues involved in body cameras that beyond what we think there are. Everything from privacy to storage to the practical nature of them, and rising expectations.
Just wanted to piggyback on what Jim was saying and sort of how he kicked off his comments by saying to some extent it depends what we mean by working. So there's the issue of use of force going down, arrests going down. There's a study that just came out from Mesa, Arizona. So try to do something similar to Rialto, do a randomized study. There were a set of police officers who volunteered to wear cameras, a set of police officers who were told to wear cameras, and then a set of police officers who weren't wearing cameras at all. So it was a comparison of, what does their day look like? What are their interactions with the public? What do those look like? And so one of the things that's found, similar findings in terms of use of force, also found that the citations given, the number of citations given went up. Which again, could be a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think then you have to figure out, do you want more citations? Sort of the theory about that is that officers were worried that if there were circumstances in which before they would have exercised discretion about when to give citations, now there might be somebody looking over their shoulder. There might be a supervisor looking over their shoulder after the fact to say, you know, I see you could have given out a citation for whatever it was and you didn't. So those went up. And then I think there's also, to some extent, a kind of ineffable piece, but it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, about what it means generally for the relationship between the officer and the department and the community as a whole. Does it help the relationship in some ways, in many ways, if uses of force are going down? How does it affect the relationship if there are more citations? But also just how does it affect the relationship to have this camera mediating those interactions in a variety of ways? And that, I think, is probably something that we don't know the answer to yet, although certainly we're getting sort of, you know, some anecdotes from different communities about what that feels like.
And before we started this, I'd asked on Twitter if people had questions that they wanted the panel to ask. And sort of piggybacking off of that, one of the questions came from a Twitter user who said, how do the cops themselves feel? He says, you know, my brother quit the force, and this was a big factor in doing so. So I'm just curious, maybe Jim, you might be able to weigh in on that. Are officers themselves, you know, concerned about this? Are they giving out more citations because they feel pressure from police administrators to implement this? Does it make them feel perhaps more secure or more nervous?
So this is a very complicated issue that I wish I had a simple answer to, but the answer is it depends. So one thing we don't spend a lot of time studying in policing research is the policing culture. And it's the culture, not only overall, but more specifically the individual department culture that drives a lot of how officers feel about their work, how they're perceived. Do they believe that not only the community, but more importantly for them, does the administration, does the police chief and their supervisors support them, and how things are messaged. So one of the questions around Mesa is, you know, what's the organizational culture like in the temperament? We talk a lot in policing, and I personally think that the most important issue today in policing is this notion of police legitimacy and procedural justice. So when we talk about that, for instance, and you talk to police officers and say, we want you to do that, one of the very first places they're going to go is, okay, chief, you want us to do all this stuff externally, that's great. When are you going to do it internally, right? So cops have their own perspective on how they are treated internally in terms of the disciplinary process, the promotional process, the reward systems, how things are messaged internally. And if the leadership of a department is good in terms of messaging what's in it for the officer about the cameras, then they're probably much more likely to say, I need that if for no other reason than it's going to support my assertion that I did the right thing. It's a way of proving that I did the right thing. If it's not messaged correctly, then cops will say, so this is just another way for you to Monday morning quarterback that very tough decision I had to make in a split second, and I am going to get hammered. And this is now you start getting into this notion of depolicing, where the officers say, you know, I'm just doing what I have to do because in the furtherance of my job trying to protect you, you might actually prosecute me and take away my livelihood and my ability to take care of my family. So these are emotional sentiments that police officers have. My experience has been that when police officers understand the value of having a recording device, in my department we had audio recording devices for, well, my whole career. They understood the value of using those because it almost always exonerated the officers. There were instances where it didn't. It actually supported the complainant's position on that. But we didn't have problems around the discipline related to that. And I think that some officers are going to say this is terrible and I'm getting out of the business because of it. And I think a lot of people say it is just the way it is now. And I will, as you said a moment ago, in 5 years, this will be standard. In my opinion, this will be as ubiquitous in a police officer's equipment as handcuffs or their radio or their handgun. It's just going to be part of the job.
One of the things that we often hear is that this changes behavior on both sides of the camera. It seems to be affecting police behavior. Is it changing community behavior? Do people feel more Are they aware that this is happening? We're constantly surveilled, right? In Camden, there are 120 surveillance cameras in the city alone that constantly are feeding video into a centralized database. So does it change behavior on either side of the camera? So for the police officer and for the policed, if you will, or the communities that they're trying to protect?
I mean, I think one level is, yes, of course it does. It's obvious, and some of the studies back up that there is this, civilizing effect, which to any sort of person who's steeped in privacy and civil liberties is a slightly spooky term. The deeper question is, what does that look like and what's the shape of that? And we don't really know. It's too early to know the full sociological effects of this. I think it is true that there are more and more, for better or worse, there are more and more cameras. There are government-run surveillance cameras, which we oppose, which watch people whether anybody is present or not. Everybody's carrying a video camera in their pocket now. People are putting them on their bicycle helmets and their car dashboards and so forth. When you are being watched all the time, I think that's not a good thing for the American public and our public spaces, and people feel there will be chilling effects, and it might take a while for people to realize just how under surveillance they are, but eventually they will, and it may have chilling effects on American life. Now, when you're in the presence of a uniformed police officer, you're already pretty chilled most of the time. You're gonna watch yourself a little bit. So in some ways, those cameras probably have less chilling effects than most cameras, as opposed to a camera that's sitting up there, and you and your lover are the only two people on the street, and there's some camera that's watching you. That's a completely different kettle of fish. So one of the reasons that we have not been totally against body cameras, we're against them if the policies aren't good, but the reason that we're willing to accept them if the policies are good is that you're in front of a uniformed police officer, and if you do something illegal and there's no camera, then you're going to go into court, and the officer's going to say, I saw him do this, and you're going to say, I didn't do it. Maybe you didn't do it, but it's still your word against the officer, and the officer's word is always going to win. Uniformed officer against accused criminal. But now there's a video, and so if you did something illegal, instead of just the officer's word, now they have video to back it up. I mean, how much of a difference is that? Versus now, if the officer's lying, you have some protection.
I think that there's some question. I mean, so at Streetwise and Safe, we focus and work with youth of color who are obviously some of the populations who are the population that's most targeted by discriminatory policing practices. Body cameras are intended to protect. We specifically work with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth of color who have experienced homelessness and policing and criminalization. So they're a population at the intersection of a lot of different kinds of discrimination, including discriminatory policing. And we've had a lot of conversations about body cameras and this question of will it actually prevent police misconduct? Will it prevent the kinds of policing practices that they experience on a day-to-day basis? I think they're clear about documentation, but will it prevent things? And for them and for many people who are in the larger coalition that we're part of in New York City, Communities United for Police Reform, there's more questions than answers. And I think particularly you're talking to a community that just watched 2 police officers choke a man to death on camera, knowing that they were being filmed, that watched police officers put a 7-month pregnant woman in a chokehold, black pregnant woman in a chokehold on camera, knowing that they were being watched, and who can find on YouTube countless videos from dash cams and body cams of police officers engaging in abusive behavior. So I think they have really solid questions about whether this actually changes police officer behavior. They've heard from young people in New Orleans of the same community, LGBT youth of color, about a police officer there who turned off their body camera, walked up to someone, shot them, and turned it back on again. And I think they really have questions, as does the ACLU and others, about what the policies are going to be and how the programs are going to play out before they will feel confident that it will actually change police officer behavior towards them, and think that there's still a lot more questions and answers and a lot of cost-benefit analysis that needs to be undertaken as well.
Well, and oftentimes we hear that it's communities of color and lower income communities that are the ones that are more heavily policed and therefore will be more heavily surveilled. Is that something that you're hearing as well in terms of being a concern for the use of these body cameras?
Very much so, and I think people are particularly concerned about the impacts of surveillance given who they are. and what it looks like, for instance, when in Washington State, the video is almost live streamed on YouTube. If you're a young queer person of color who appears in a particular way, perhaps in a particular context where you feel safe, you don't necessarily want that same footage up on the internet where others might see it who might not be as familiar with you appearing in a particular way. Also a concern in Washington State was vice raids that went up on the internet. And don't get me wrong, vice raids are a context in which tremendous amounts of police abuse take place, and particularly against women of color, and particularly against LGBT people of color who are or are perceived to be involved in the sex trades. And so there is a desire to document that police violence, but if it's also a tremendous invasion of privacy, and then to have that footage up on the internet is a triple concern. There's now people who are accused of engaging in prostitution who were half clothed in the videos, whose videos are now up on the internet for anyone to see. And I think that that is a particular concern that folks have. And then I think the broader surveillance concern, particularly for homeless people who have nowhere else to go and who are constantly in public space, feels very hard in the ways that Jay was talking about.
I want to add on one other piece, sort of just in terms of I guess the contribution of the cameras to accountability, and this is maybe playing off a little bit something that Jay had said, which is that, as we know, what the camera is capturing is what the officer is seeing. So it's capturing the officer's behavior only insofar as either the officer is saying something or the person that is recording reacts to something the officer is doing. So you might be able to reach, and obviously, it would capture something like the sound of a gunshot, things like that. But it's a fairly narrow view, depending, I've watched a couple of, kind of videos from body cameras, as we probably all have, depending on where it's worn. Sometimes you're like looking at somebody's chest, you can't really make out the whole area, which in some ways is good. I think probably, at least from a privacy and civil liberties standpoint, would have a broader concern about a camera that was showing a really panoramic view or something that somehow enabled a top down. But I think it does also speak to the limitations of what you're getting from the camera, that it's kind of a narrow view. And it is really of the person that's having the interaction with the police officer and not the police officer themselves.
And I do feel that a lot of the examples that you gave where there has been accountability and people have felt like there was some success in the thing being recorded was community-based recording. And what Jay was saying about everyone having a camera in their pocket and creating a culture where if there's interaction going down that people feel concerned about, that we all start recording, and that evidence, there's also questions about then what happens with that footage, and we need to come up with some agreements about how that is used. But I think that feels like a different experience of achieving maybe the same result.
It's really important that policies are put in place that turn this technology into one that is an accountability tool and that will shift power to protect communities, especially communities that have bad relationships with their police departments. And there's a real danger that these cameras will become just another means of police, exerting power. If they have complete control over which videos get released, which is a big battle that we're starting to fight now. A lot of the police departments, even that support cameras, they want complete control over what gets released. And the inevitable result will be that when an officer saves a baby from drowning, the video will be on the news, but when an officer does something that's kind of dodgy, they'll keep that under wraps. And also, it's important that other policies be good as well in terms of when the recording is taking place and so forth. So I think that, the suspicions of the clients that you work with, may be well-founded. I think if good policies are put in place, they can be a good thing and they can be dealt with. But we are seeing, and we're seeing departments where they have good body camera policies, but they're not enforced. So an officer is supposed to be turning it on, but doesn't turn it on, and shoots somebody, and then says, "Oh, I didn't have it on," and there's no consequences or discipline to that officer. And in those cases, police body cameras are not going to be a good thing.
I think
Is there a consensus of when you turn it on, when you turn it off? Is there sort of a broad-based, right, or as broad as can be, agreement on it should be on 90% of your shift, or if it should be on 90% of your shift or 100% of your shift, and I have a tip for you, and I don't want to be filmed, or I have a sensitive situation, there's a domestic abuse situation, are there or should there be times when the officer should be allowed to turn it off? Do I, as the person with the tip or with the sensitive case, do I have the power to tell the officer, Can you turn it off? I'd like to tell you, like, how, when do you turn it on, when do you turn it off?
Well, I mean, there's two answers to that, which is what's happening out there. And I think that it's fair to say there's a pretty broad consensus that the camera should be turned on whenever an officer is involved in a law enforcement action or call for service or any kind of encounter that becomes hostile in any way. There have been some proposals, and we initially called for this, that basically all interactions with the citizens be taped. That's just not really happening. I don't see many departments doing that, and we have actually backed off that because the privacy consequences are much worse. There is a danger that if you give police utter discretion to turn it on and turn it off, they'll turn it off, they'll engage in abuse, they'll turn it back on again, they'll edit on the fly. And it's important that police officers not have discretion, but have very clear rules about when that video is expected to be on. And we have called for officers having, turning it off if they're interviewing a crime victim, if the crime victim wants it off, if they're entering a private home, a consensual entry. If they're doing a SWAT raid, we want them on because there's so many abuses in SWAT raids. But, or if they are, getting a tip, a crime tip from somebody in the neighborhood who wants to whisper something to the officer but doesn't want that on video. Those are reasonable exceptions. If the officer's in line to get donuts and wants to chat with people in the community, there's no reason for the camera to be on in that situation.
I think this highlights who's missing from this panel right now, I just have to tell you, and that is our elected officials, because so much of this is driven by what state law says or what the mayor says. If I was a mayor and I had a police chief who didn't hold somebody accountable, who turned off their camera, shot a guy and turned the camera back on, I'd be looking for a new police chief. So I think that this highlights the role of elected officials in laying down state legislation, number one, but also highlights the difficulty for police officers who tend to be very pragmatic in their orientation. Just tell me what the rule is. So right now we're talking about privacy versus transparency. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to turn it on all the time? Or you want me to keep it off all the time? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? I don't think it makes any sense to film victims of crime and those things. Certainly, if there's an enforcement activity on the part of the officer, you got to have the camera running because those things can go sideways in 2 seconds. But if you wanted to tell me about somebody committing a crime or I'm interviewing you and you're a crime victim, I don't think that camera has any business running. There are going to be advances in the technology that automate some of this. So in other words, if I pull my gun, my holster would be a smart holster communicating with the camera. I pull my gun and it turns on the camera. If I pull my taser, it turns on the camera. If it has some voice recognition capability in there, if certain keywords are used, the camera comes on, right? So you can avoid some of this, do I turn the camera on or off? Because there is a practical reality for police officers when they are involved in an enforcement activity that the last thing on their mind, quite frankly, is pushing that button to turn it on. They're looking at that person. If they think that there's any chance whatsoever that that person might harm them, then that's what they're going to focus on first, right? So if we can find a way to automate that and take that off, then that turns them on. But there are other things that have nothing to do with the technology about this accountability stuff, turning them on or off and doing all of that. And whether we like it or not, all of us have to accept the fact that police officers need a certain level of discretion to do their job, and that discretion and what happens or doesn't happen in terms of transparency issues, retention issues, and all that are set in the law. The cops follow what the law is, and if you don't like the law, then the people you need to be talking to are the state legislators to try to get them to change that, and that drives the behavior of the police in large part. There are other issues. It's not that simplistic, but there are other things that I think the police have been, the blame for some of these issues, I guess, have been laid at the front door of the police, and I'm not sure that that's where they should be. They should be someplace, right? They should change the law if that's a problem. And you highlighted some of those things, right?
No doubt, and I think one thing that there is consensus about across the board is that there needs to be, given all the questions, a very thoughtful process before jumping into, as you call it, full penetration. I think in the wake of the incidents that you mentioned and many others, people have sort of, in a grasping for solutions that would prevent things that many people feel were terrible abuses of people's rights. We're sort of reaching for a solution. A company that makes tasers sort of offered one up in terms of body cameras, and we want to think about where that's coming from. But I think that the uniform, or at least there's consensus now, that we need a broad public consultation process. And even, the Police Executive Research Forum says, once an agency goes down the road of deploying body-worn cameras, it's increasingly difficult to scale them back, right? So I think that we need to have public consultation processes about issues of discretion, around issues of consent, around issues of access to footage, obviously around issues of purposes of footage, evidentiary concerns. There's as you say, those are in the domain of lawmakers, freedom of information. There's so much in there, what exceptions there might be around domestic violence instances in people's private homes, instances, as I was mentioning, in vice operations, but also in some undercover operations around enforcement of lewd conduct statutes, for instance, is another issue of concern for LGBT communities. Domestic violence is very much an issue of concern for LGBT communities in terms of filming those responses, and I understand police officers feel that those are some of the more dangerous things to respond to and would want to have the cameras on in those situations, and then how do we balance that with the privacy of people who are, one, experiencing some of the most difficult and challenging moments of their lives, and secondly, may have other privacy concerns in those situations. So there just needs to be so much public conversation around this before we jump headlong into something that could have so many unintended consequences for people, for all stakeholders on all sides of this issue, I would say, including police officers.
And I just add sort of two empirical points to the conversation. One is related to Jim's point about police officers wanting to know, when am I supposed to turn this on? Again, the study from Mesa, Arizona, that sort of the final findings came out recently. One of the interesting things they found was that if there's basically a requirement that cameras be turned on at a certain point, something like 80% of the cameras are turned on, or during 80% of those interactions that policy is complied with. If it's discretionary, they're turned on 50% of the time, which does suggest that when police officers are told or given guidance, look, in these 9 circumstances they go on, then by and large they go on. The other thing is that we have been looking some kind of comparing the policies that are out there. Most jurisdictions right now that are using body cameras are in sort of the pilot project phase, but most of them have published policies that deal with them. So we had looked at the guidance that PERF, the Police Executive Research Foundation, had put out. And then also different jurisdictions around the country in terms of when they're supposed to go on. And I was expecting, to be honest, that most of the jurisdictions would basically follow the PERF guidance, which lists just kind of a variety of kinds of interactions. There's a decent amount of variation, not widely, but I think different cities, different departments have sort of decided on different times when the cameras would be turned on, which may be totally appropriate. There may be different needs in a given jurisdiction. This may be kind of the laboratories of democracy that the states and the cities provide to see, okay, how does it play out in terms of effectiveness and community relationships in this scenario, this scenario, this scenario. But right now there is at least some variation across the country in terms of when they're triggered, when their use is triggered.
If I could just add one more thing, is also that I think what's critical as much as a consultation process on the front end is a consultation process and evaluation on the back end that takes into account all of these things, including the primary purpose of changing behavior, but then also how the unintended consequences are playing out for different communities. And I feel like that's one that needs to engage all stakeholders.
I think this discussion also underscores why it is so important for the police and the community to co-produce public safety and co-produce good policy around the use of body-worn cameras, because there's a reason we have 17,000 police departments. I mean, on some level that makes no sense, right? But it makes sense when you understand communities' desire to customize and tailor the kind of policing they want in their communities. Whether that's right or wrong, that's kind of how we've ended up. So in some communities, you may have lots of community involvement with the police department around policy formulation, and that results in a different triggering of when you turn them on and when you turn them off and all of that. And I think that's appropriate as long as there are some guidelines set up to make, and some auditing mechanisms and ways to make sure you're really doing that. But that's where the transparency comes in the community co-producing those policies with the police department is where you address these kinds of things that I may be a well-meaning police chief or police officer trying to do the right thing in that domestic violence situation, but have no real sensitivity or understanding about how it's perceived by somebody else or why that's a problem. And that's, again, where this is just not a simple issue. I mean, it's just full of gray areas. I wish it was simpler.
One area that I think is pretty clear cut from a lot of police departments is cost. We continue to hear that the police departments are having trouble paying for these devices, paying for storage and the infrastructure that goes along with that. Washington is starting to put money towards body cameras, quite a significant amount of money. And there have been hearings about this. And I'm wondering whether or not that money that police departments need in order to implement these cameras should mean that those departments are required to follow some sort of federal guidelines. Short of any law, should there be federal guidelines that require police departments, that they're required to meet in order to access these funds that are starting to come down the pike?
There's a model already out there that dictates that. The Department of Justice provides funding for police departments to purchase ballistic vests for their officers, and in order to access that money to offset the cost of those vests, you must have a policy that mandates that officers wear those vests. So you could do the same kind of thing, right? If you're going to accept our money to buy those cameras, then you have to have a policy that has these elements in it.
And the Justice Department is preparing to distribute the $10 million that President Obama announced was going to be provided in grants to localities. And they have made some noises about conditioning receipt of those grants on having a good policy in place. The details haven't been worked out yet, so it's not clear what that's going to look like and exactly how prescriptive they're going to be. But that was a good thing, and it's what you're talking about.
And I think it's policies, I think there's a few things, right? There's policies in terms of wearing them, in terms of the privacy piece, in terms of the sort of accessibility to the public, which is, I think, a very complicated issue. And then there's also, I think, a piece about gathering the data, right? So how, assuming that a lot of this is happening in a pilot program context and the money is being given for that, what kinds of information are these jurisdictions gathering? Are they gathering in a way that's comparable across departments, across cities, to really allow, the Justice Department, the BJA groups it's working with, 2, 4, 10 years down the line to do some of this retrospective look at how are they being used, do they work, what are the consequences? Because I think without that, it's going to be really hard to make any assessment of kind of, are these contributing and how to kind of a variety of values.
Which is why all of this legislation should have a component to it that says we're going to evaluate this, and there needs to be funding set aside for the science of this stuff. So how do we know this works 2 years out, 5 years out?
I would agree with all of what's been said, and also that there needs to be resources for community members to participate meaningfully in those evaluations in terms of the research and also being able to assess the effectiveness in individual interactions. I do feel compelled to say on behalf of the young people who I have the privilege of working with that one of their first responses to this was how many millions of dollars and why are there still only 200 shelter beds in New York City for LGBTQ young people? Could we not put some of this money towards the things that would keep us out of the crosshairs of policing, either for things that we're not doing or for things we have no choice but to do because there are no other options available to us? And I feel like that is a question around the millions of dollars that are going into this, particularly from folks who are feeling like it might not actually change their day-to-day experience of policing.
On the other hand, I think some police chiefs are calculating that the body cameras, if they perform as advertised, may save them a lot of money that they would otherwise spend on settlements of police abuse lawsuits. If they can civilize their police officers, that they'll actually spend much less money overall because despite the cost of the cameras, they'll be paying less money out in lawsuits. And that money could be used for many other things, of course.
I want to talk a little bit about, Jay, you mentioned this earlier about accessibility to the videos. Who should be able to see them, FOIA requests, media. Lawmakers in at least 15 states have introduced legislation that would limit how much of that video is available to the public. So who should access these videos? Who should be able to prevent access to the videos? Should all these videos be made available to the public? Should they be streamed on YouTube, even if they are blurred out and redacted? And, you know, are there certain states that are sort of on one side of the spectrum and others that are a little more lenient in that regard? Because I think that that's a really important question. It's one thing to record the video, it's another thing to make it accessible, whether that's to the general public here or to folks like us in the media.
So that's a really key question, and we've been asked a lot about it by localities who are trying to struggle with these complicated issues, and so we've given a fair amount of thought. And what we have been recommending is that you know, most of the video that's taken really go into a black box, unless and be held for a certain relatively limited period of time, 60, 90 days or what have you, and then be deleted. Unless there is a use of force by an officer, a felony arrest, or there's been a complaint against a police officer, in which case that video is flagged, is retained for a longer period of time, and is available to the public via open records requests, you know, state FOIA requests. And that video should not routinely be, you know, be searched. There shouldn't be face recognition, no analytics. Even, you know, police management really shouldn't be looking at video unless an officer calls attention to it, because we don't want officers to feel like they're being nitpicked by management, or that management's out to get them, or that they have to, you know, give way too many tickets, which is what the MESA study found, because they'll be dinged by their superiors if they exercise any discretion and look the other way at anything. And that, and so, you know, we think that what we're seeing out there are some extremes, and some of them are set by state open records laws. Some states like Minnesota, Washington State, New Mexico have very broad open records laws that basically define all video that's captured by all cameras as an open records request. And we think that that is the wrong balance for privacy, because all kinds of stuff that's not of public importance but is very private to people will be publicly releasable. You will see tabloid TV seeking all this video to run things for purely prurient interests. And now we're on the other side of the spectrum, the other extreme.
The TMZ effect,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah. The other extreme we're seeing is like a law that was just passed in South Carolina, and the LAPD's policy, which basically allow the public to access none of the footage, which I talked about earlier. It'll just end up being a police propaganda tool. If there's a shooting of an unarmed person, that's publicly important information, and that video should be released. There's a good chance there'll be bystander video, and certainly the bystanders will just slap it up on YouTube. The only video that would be not released is the police video. And so we know that's a delicate balance, and neither extreme is the right one. Basically, it should not be publicly releasable unless there's a felony arrest, a use of force, or there's been a complaint against a police officer. We think that's the right balance.
I do think it's critical to have the consent of the person who was filmed be an integral, if not determinative, part of that calculus, because for the reasons I was just talking about earlier, there is plenty of footage, for instance, of you know, people in various states of undress. I mean, there's just so much there, but also that I think there's fundamental privacy concerns, and there's issues of public interest. I think there's a balance where you could do it either only with the person's consent, or at least where there's a court involved in determining whether the public interest is you know, outweighs the privacy concerns, and that the court would also factor in the consent of the person in the video. And again, that raises you know, 10 more complicated questions about if all 5 of us are, you know, the police rush in right now and something happens, I might want it out on the internet, you might not, right? You know, and then how do we navigate that? And then that raises the issues of blurring people's faces and redaction, which then ups the cost. So I think that what Jay's putting out there is kind of an ideal. I would throw in consent of the individuals taped as an integral part of that calculus, but then it just raises many more questions. But I fully agree that we can't have sort of footage just flying up on the internet of every interaction. And I agree with you that that is a problem currently with bystander footage that we need to figure out ways to collectively address as well.
And I think this also raises one other interesting issue, which speaks to the public release, but also just thinking about these videos generally, that I think, you know, sort of the perception is if there's a video out there, that's going to show us what happened, right? And this has played into, as I think both Jim and Jay were saying, often these videos do end up exonerating police officers. Sometimes they end up exonerating the accused, but that there's sort of a story they tell. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, both from research and just sort of anecdotally, is that not surprisingly, different people see videos differently. So you sort of take your own biases into watching the video. There was some interesting research showing, interviewing motorists of color who were stopped and white motorists who were stopped. Maybe something like 10% of the white motorists who were stopped, who saw a police officer walking towards them, saw the police officer's hand on his or her service weapon, although it was a requirement that the officer always do that. About 60% of the motorists of color did. And so part of the theory is, well, the motorists of color they were key to this. It was a very salient fact to them if the officer had his hand on his gun. And with the videos also, I mean, there's been, a variety of studies on this, that people will see different things in them, not just maybe see or not see something the police officer did, but really come to different conclusions based on what they bring. And so I think we'll see all that playing out as well, to the extent that videos are released publicly, or even just to the extent that they're used as part of a case or as part of a complaint, even if it's literally only the complainant and people in the police department seeing them. There may still be kind of different narratives that come out of a single video.
I think it's an excellent point, and I think that there needs to be, everybody, all of us need to get more sophisticated in how we interpret videos. Videos are not an objective record of what took place, camera angle, lighting, when it's turned on, when it's turned off, and so forth. And of course, as you said, a lot of the body camera videos, just catching somebody's chest. In fact, somebody was saying that in England they were having a problem that a lot of tall police officers were interviewing women, and it was just looking straight at their cleavage.
Okay.
But at the same time, this point can be exaggerated. I think that, I was talking to a judge, and she said, I can't tell you, I have all these cases, complaints against police officers or what have you, and it's just one person's word against another person's word, and it's completely muddy, and you don't even know where to start. There are a lot of times where video does more or less tell you what happens. There will be cases where the video doesn't tell you what happens. There will be cases where the video is probably deceiving. There will be cases where the video is clear as day. But overall, I think that would be better off than he said, she said, officer in crisp uniform versus accused criminal.
This, though, underscores, I think, the need to put a lot more resources toward the science and the research around this, because we're all entitled and have our opinions. There's 60 people in here. We all have 60 opinions of when they should come on, when they shouldn't, retention, et cetera, et cetera. What we're not entitled to is our own set of facts, and the problem is we don't know enough about this field yet, right? My guess is that we're going to have lots of differing opinions about this for quite a while, just like we do a lot of other issues here. But the extent to which science can develop good findings about what works and what doesn't work to achieve mutually agreeable goals is where we will ultimately develop a national coherence around this. And we're not going to do that until then, because we are people with opinions, and we all have a different opinion about all of this.
At a recent Senate hearing, the issue of hackability of these videos came up. And of course, just 2 weeks ago, there was a huge hack of Washington's data. Hacking is now a standard part of, I think, a lot of our lives, right? Everything from our healthcare systems to the government have been hacked. So what's to prevent a small town police department from becoming hacked and having these videos, whether they have policies in place or not to protect privacy? What's to prevent that from happening? I mean, are these police departments really equipped to protect the integrity of that video and that data?
And I think in some ways it's a slightly different question, which is any police department equipped? Because by and large, I think most of the sort of major platforms, the major companies that are producing body cameras, they manage the information by and large. So I think for most of these, the police department sort of keeps ownership, but the actual data basically is being sent up to the cloud. Mm-hmm. And so it's a question of cloud safety. Is there a way to hack into it? Or, as most of these hacks turn out to be happening, or is there a way to get somebody's credentials, to fool somebody into getting access to the information? And then absolutely, and then there's potentially a big motherload of information, which in part goes to the question of how long is this kept? And the less time the sort of quote unquote irrelevant video is kept, there's at least less video, fewer videos to be accessed, but I do think that's an issue.
This becomes more problematic when many of the really small police departments who have their hearts in the right place, they're trying to get involved in video technology and cannot afford these big vendors you're talking about. This is expensive technology. So they go online and they find a $70 clippable camera that you just take the SD card out and upload it to your PC. So because they know they need to do this, but those things are hugely accessible to hackers and all of that.
And there have been several police departments, smaller ones around the country, that have been hacked by ransomware companies that
Right.
basically encrypt their hard drives. And
Right.
several small police departments have had to pay, thousands of dollars to like Russian hackers to get their data back. So it's a very real problem.
We've talked a little bit about the public and the media being able to access these videos, but what about the officers themselves who are the ones that are wearing the cameras? Should officers be allowed to view their own video, and if so, when? And if not, why?
I mean, I think that officers should be able to view their own video most of the time. They might want to review how they handled something. They might want to use it for training purposes, to refresh their memory about things. The only time they really should not is if there's a critical incident, such as a shooting, where there's automatically going to be an investigation of what happened. And when there's an investigation, you don't show witnesses the evidence you have before you take their statements. I mean, no detective would do that. We have one set of evidence, which is what the police officer remembers about what took place, and we have another set of evidence, which is the video, and neither one is objective, and the memories in the video are always going to be different, but you take one statement and set of evidence and capture that before you show the video to the officer so that the evidence doesn't become cross-contaminated. If you show the officer the video before you take his or her initial statement, then you are contaminating and literally changing. Studies have shown the officer's memory of what took place. And also, if the officer has done something wrong, you're giving them an opportunity to lie most effectively. If the camera swings away for a moment, the officer can say, well, that's when he reached in his waistband or what have you. Now, after giving an initial statement and capturing the officer's initial memory of things, if the officer then views the video and wants to elaborate or explain something that was on the video that wasn't in his or her statement, then of course they can do that. But this is a very divisive issue where civil libertarians and police many police around the country have felt strongly the other way. And there's a common sense thing. Well, why not let the police officer give their best version of what happened by looking at the video? But because of this contamination of evidence and lying issues, it's a bad idea.
And I would argue that should be extended to any criminal prosecution to the extent that the video is being introduced as part of a criminal prosecution for exactly the same reasons. I'm quite sure that's going to be controversial as a recommendation, but I feel that, as Rachel was saying, that it's part of a story, and showing it in advance of a criminal prosecution. And I have seen, and been part of cases on the defense team where video has very much exonerated defendants. But I still feel like the ability to tailor your testimony in a criminal prosecution to something that you've seen before you give your initial statement, is upsetting the balance of due process and fairness in those situations, and for all the reasons that Jay just gave.
This is confusing even within the policing community, and so lawyers that defend police officers would be able to cite scientific evidence to the contrary of what we've just heard and have a very different position about their clients' rights and what makes sense. So even within the policing community, if you were all police chiefs, half of you would say they should look at it and half of you would say they shouldn't look at it. Obviously, police officer attorneys would say they should look at it. One of the things I think that I'll go back again, we just don't understand enough about our memory and how things, how something appears to be the case that turns out later on not to be the case. And because we have such an orientation toward blaming in this society, we fail to say, we're not blaming anybody, we want to understand how this works. And I don't know how we get around that. I think there are ways to do that in many instances where we say we had a bad outcome. Now, how do we get to a better outcome? And we're not going to blame anybody for that. There are forums for that. There's civil court and criminal court and all that. But we don't have a vehicle right now to look at critical incidents without blaming, and therefore we deny ourselves huge opportunities to learn from a bad incident that had bad outcomes, because we need to make sure that somebody is blamed for whatever happened. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't hold people accountable. I'm just saying it's a difficult model. And again, if you had some attorneys in here that represent police officers, you'd hear something very different from them about what the science says and what they believe is appropriate.
I think one of the things is the police officers are afraid that, you know, their memory naturally will probably not exactly match the video because that's the way the human brain works, and that they'll be made to look like liars. And it's a legitimate concern, but everybody else in the criminal justice system has to deal with that as well. The defendant does, and witnesses, and so forth. So, I mean, police shouldn't get special treatment in terms of being able to see the video before they give their initial statement. And I do think that, you know, body cameras do have a real potential for it to be an excellent training tool. And you know, doctors have a thing where they all meet once a week and they talk about their medical errors in a sort of an environment of not blaming, but like, how can I prevent this from happening again? What did I do wrong here? And sort of and it would be nice to see that evolve as a standard feature within police departments, which is, you know, I had these 3 encounters this week, and they turned south, and let's look at it together, and let's talk about how I could have de-escalated it better, and so forth. And so I think there's a real potential, you know, that this could be a tool that will get at some of the deeper issues. And you know, body cameras are not the solution to the problems of policing in America. They are, to some extent,
Absolutely.
a Band-Aid. And you know, the real solutions are, you know, changing the culture of some departments so that they be, you know, as somebody said recently, they think of themselves as guardians and not as warriors. And that they don't feel like occupying armies in some neighborhoods and so forth. And these are very deep, complex things, and body cameras may have a role, but you know, but I think that better training and so forth is really the direction that things need to go.
So I would agree with that statement that the footage has huge potential for training officers. So we have footage, we want to use it for training, except the law or policy or community expectation says you can't keep it for privacy reasons, so you can't keep it. So this is where you have retention and erasing of that same video runs head on into the reality, right? Great video for training, except we can't keep it because the law says we can't do it. So this is where we've got to find a way to meet both of those interests. The video, it's very hard to watch, of the Texas officer that completely mishandles the incident involving the kids at the pool party is a great training video for thoughtful departments that want to hold this up and say to their officers, see this, don't do this, but let's talk about how that cop got himself into that place, what happened there. But that's not body camera video, that's somebody holding up a video.
And I just want to again emphasize that, right? Which is that I think I think in New York City, we've been successful in creating a culture of cop watch, where now in my neighborhood in Crown Heights, any stop and frisk happens, there's 5 of us out there filming. And that may be producing the same result, changing everyone's behavior in the situation. I've certainly seen it where literally a police officer had pepper spray out in a very mild situation during Pride in New York City. I pulled my iPhone out, the pepper spray went back in, and everything dissolved. You know, and that was it. And I feel like if we could achieve maybe many of the same results by supporting and coming up with collective agreements about how we do it as community members for and by each other, that would also capture more of the bigger picture, might have different perspectives. So I feel like there might be other ways of arriving at.
But we need to be careful, I think, as we go down this road. And I'm trying not to put my cop hat on for just a second here. When we want to hold those people accountable, I'm all for that. I mean, I think your example makes sense to me. But you have to remember that these are the same people that you expect to run headlong into a very dangerous situation that you have called 911 about. So that when we begin to, and there's a balance here between holding them accountable and demonizing the people who risk their lives for perfect strangers. And I personally believe this is a very slippery slope for us as society, because everybody in this room and everybody watching this, if you are being attacked by somebody, you are going to call 911 and you want them to get there as fast as they can and save you. And that means they're going to use their discretion, they're going to use all these tools available to them. And if we are not careful about the messages we send to those people who, again, are willing to donate their lives for your safety. And if you doubt that, I encourage you to go by the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial, where there's about 21,000 names of cops who have died in this country protecting their communities. We have to be careful about the message we send to those people who are willing to do that. I'm not denying what you just said. And there is a balance here. There is a very clear balance about how we do that. We just have to be careful, because you're not the people that respond if I call 911.
No, and there's nothing in what I'm saying that denies those realities.
Right. I'm just saying we have to be careful how we talk about this, because, believe it or not, cops are people too. Right?
I don't think the problem in our society, though, is that cops are getting too little deference and respect in terms of, you know, their use of force. In many cases, The law allows officers to use force when it's completely not necessary, but it's completely legal. And there is a problem with, unfortunately, with excessive use of force and police abuse that I think has remained hidden. It has been apparent to especially people of color and low-income people, but has been invisible to white middle-class elites who kind of run things in most cities. And I think that the video is playing a role in opening a lot of people's eyes as to what often does happen. And I think that, you know, hopefully, ultimately, we'll move forward to a path of understanding, and that, you know, that the police video cameras will play a disciplinary role in curbing back those officers who might be a little bit out of control, or departments that have bad cultures. But at the same time, it also has the potential to increase understanding among the public about what police officers do face. You know, some of these videos are going to show heroic actions and already have. So, you know, I think greater understanding on all sides can only be a good thing.
This is why legislation is so important. If we don't like the law or the court decision that sets the sidelines for police use of force, then we need to change that. And the rules need to change, and the guidance to police officers need to change, much like the Supreme Court decision that said, you cannot shoot somebody who's running away from you, right? That was useful to everybody. It changed, you know, and then somebody who does it's going to go to jail for the rest of their life, you know, as a result of that. But those are the kinds of things that are pragmatic realities where you hear cops say this all the time. Just tell me what the rules are. I will follow those to the best of my ability. But when these rules are, and the sidelines are this wide, and I'm operating within them, then I may not be the problem. I mean, I may be, but that's not the problem. It's bring in narrow those sidelines or something so that I understand the rules better. I mean, they're
So-
different places.
To bring it back to a point that Jay made, I was interviewing Malkia Cyril, who's the executive director for the Center for Media Justice recently, for a piece on body cameras. And she said that, and I'm quoting here, the footage itself, even when caught in the act, doesn't necessarily translate to accountability. Quote, if anyone is going to stand behind body cameras, advocating for them, they need to also stand for comprehensive police reform. And I think that's what you were touching on right now. What does that police reform look like, going beyond the technology? Because that's just something that we're hearing also out of Camden, right? Can't you go to Camden, New Jersey? They say, yes, we've got 120 surveillance cameras, a data center, body cameras, and we've also got 2 cops on every street corner talking to residents, you know, doing ride-alongs with folks. And so they're saying that the secret to that has also been a tremendous focus on community policing. But is there more that can be done beyond just old-fashioned policing and technology in terms of actual police reform? And if so, what is that?
I mean, broadly, I think I would say, you know, better training, and training that's oriented towards teaching police officers how to de-escalate effectively, community policing, and generally having police officers be part of and in touch with the community that they're policing, not being occupying armies, and civilian oversight, that oversight boards that have teeth, that have power, and that kind of thing, and changing the culture of some police departments, as I talked about earlier. And so, you know, we can look forward to a day where police body cameras no longer seem necessary, perhaps, maybe, who knows.
I would have to agree that it comes with accountability, and that was where I was going with the example of cop watch videos, or having effective accountability after the fact, no matter who's capturing the video of what's on the video. So there may be accountability in Walter Scott's case, there isn't in Eric Garner's case. You know, how do we make sure that that the footage leads to accountability, but also to change in behavior, so we're not just having continuing aspects of accountability, but not stopping the behavior itself. And I think that goes to many kinds of reforms, not just in training and culture, but also in setting the guideposts that you were just talking about. So, and there's a list of very specific reforms in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing final report that have things like everything around narrowing use of force to what is absolutely necessary in the circumstances, as opposed to what's now permitted by law, which is much broader, as you were just saying, Jay, about having very specific guidance, for instance, around use of force against pregnant women or children or elderly people, and use of tasers. Very specific guidance around how you can engage in stops, whether you can ask for consent to a search, and then how do you make sure that there's informed and voluntary consent objectively recorded somewhere. Things that will change the way interactions happen between individuals and police officers to balance the power relations a little bit, and most of all, ensure that people's rights and safety are respected. Because co-producing public safety also means co-producing public safety against police violence, police harassment, and police discrimination. It's also about coming up with very specific guideposts around how police officers interact with particular communities who are more likely to experience police abuse. So whether that's making sure that police departments across the country have a sexual harassment policy, not among officers, they all have that because of federal law, but very few have sexual harassment and abuse policies around police interactions with members of the public. So much so that the International Association of Chiefs of Police put out a guidance in 2011 saying, you need to have this. And making sure that there's guidance around how to respectfully and safely interact with members of the LGBT community in such a way that we're not perpetrating more violence, whether intentionally or inadvertently, because those guideposts haven't been clearly set in ways that give the officers the information they need to make sure everyone's rights are respected and everyone stays safe. So I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of comprehensive police reform. And most important, however, is not the policies that are written on paper, but the enforcement and the accountability for them, because otherwise they're just the paper that they're written on. And I think if we move forward with some real policy change and real reform, and as I was saying earlier, it has to involve and be created in partnership with communities who are directly impacted. So for instance, in New York City right now, we are going through a process that's court-ordered, where the court has said people who are directly impacted have to be part of reforming what stop and frisk looks like in New York City, what policing practices look like in New York City, and the solutions lie with the people who are experiencing it on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like that's where we will move from feeling like our communities are being occupied and that there's no accountability for violence against Black bodies and communities of color to a different situation.
And just to also, I should have said also, I mean, demilitarization is a huge part of the solution. I think that we are seeing a growing number of police departments and officers who feel like and are trained like and are equipped like soldiers, as opposed to civilian peace officers, which has been the honorable tradition of policing for a long time. And again, guardian cops, moving away from warrior cops to guardian cops.
Let me add one other small piece, and I think Andrea had alluded to this before, is that I think we also shouldn't forget, and this is not necessarily to say anything about the efficacy of and contributions of body cameras, but remember that body cameras themselves are a business. That there are companies that sell body cameras, at least for one of them, for Taser, it's the same company that makes tasers, makes a very different kind of instrument for police officers. There have been questions, by no means in every department, but in a couple of departments, I think Albuquerque was one or two others, about the relationship between the police department, maybe the chief of police, and decisions being made about body cameras, and that is an overlay, which again, doesn't necessarily speak to whether they will work and what they'll contribute, but that there is sort of another issue, kind of in terms of the sort of a separate accountability piece of it to pay attention to.
I want to take the opportunity to ask the audience if they have any questions. And if you're too shy, you can always tweet me at Tanzina Vega, because I ask people to do that, and that's fine. We'll take it.
And I should say, before the microphone goes over, I know that Jim at least may need to leave in a few minutes, so if he gets up and goes, it is not a commentary on any of the questions, but he may need to leave shortly.
And I'll check to see if there are any questions that have come in recently on Twitter, but feel free. Jeremy.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Jeremy from the Electronic Privacy Information Center, and I've been involved in this kind of body camera debate. And one thing I don't see a lot of, you got a little bit in this panel, but is asking the question whether police body cameras are the best way to do accountability, right? I mean, we're having this panel on it because there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of issues. There's issues with privacy for the officers, privacy for the public, surveillance, cost, liability issues. You know, in California, where the California Highway Patrol responded to an accident, this woman got decapitated, unfortunately, this young woman, and photos of that got out, released. You know, CHP was sued. They had to pay millions of dollars. You have similar potential liability issues on here if they become ubiquitous. those vendors are going to push facial recognition and other technologies on it. It's going to become a ubiquitous surveillance tool more than an accountability tool, perhaps. The studies, all short-term, don't know if they can be replicated throughout the country. No studies on long-term whether they will have the positive outcomes as some of the short-term studies have shown. And I just don't feel like there's this struggle, this real grappling with whether it's the best way to do accountability as opposed to doing things that Jay, you mentioned earlier, teaching officers how to do, to handle situations better. A lot of times it's the officers, kind of instigating the situation, and then they're legally allowed to use force at some point, right? So just, can you respond to that? I'd appreciate it.
I think it's important to remember that a police department is a system, and that any technology, whether it's cameras or anything else, is never going to be the one thing that solves everything. That's kind of how we think about things in our society. We're looking for that one thing that solves this problem, and it's just too complicated. This issue underlying all of this about accountability has to do with who do we hire? What are the organizational values? Who becomes the police chief? The transparency and the relationship with the community, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of things. The best accountability model is where the officers hold themselves accountable. I realize that is, kind of Pollyanna-ish in many ways. If that was the case, we wouldn't have to have criminal laws and all these other things we have. But there are many other things that go into an accountability, quote-unquote, system in a police department. What do supervisors do? What are the analytics that you can pull out of your own data system that relate to the nature of arrests, where they're made, what kind of arrests are there? Are these flags that give you some insight into what that officer is doing? What are the other officers? Do they feel free to tell you that somebody did something wrong? In my former agency, this happened on a couple of occasions, and I was very proud of those people where an officer said to a supervisor, that officer that I work with every day did something wrong. Or in one instance I can think of where the officer came to us and said, I did something wrong, and you need to hold me accountable for this. I screwed up, right? So I think there's a huge difference between a mistake of the head and a mistake of the heart, and how you talk about all of this stuff inside a police department is about culture and leadership and the intangibles that make the business very difficult sometimes for people, and also create space for misuse and abuse and other kinds of places. I just think this is what we're talking about here is much bigger than cameras, and I think that's what your question alludes to, that it's much more than just a camera issue.
We did just get a question in from Twitter from Karen Dolan. She says, does the panel know if there are organized trainings for the public to record police interactions and encounters? How about the ACLU app? Seems positive.
Yes, there is an organization in a coalition in New York City called People's Justice, and there's also a website called CopWatch NYC that pulls together a lot of the resources out there. The Justice Committee in New York City and the Malcolm X grassroots movement organizations in New York City have been conducting CopWatch trainings for over 2 decades. I've attended them. And the resources are up on CopWatch NYC, and the New York Civil Liberties Union app is very helpful, and people have used it, but also, we all have our phones.
And we have a number of affiliates that have this app out, which basically you've used to record and automatically uploads the video to the ACLU if you're worried that your camera will be seized or what have you. And the most important thing that's happened, I think, in accountability overall may just be the right to record. We have had a huge struggle getting police officers to recognize that there is a First Amendment constitutional right to take photographs if you're in public in a place where you have the right to be. The ACLU has done litigation in numerous states around the country over this, and the courts have been pretty much unanimous that you have a right to record. Fortunately, we're seeing fewer and fewer police officers try to interfere with that right, but it still happens. Police officers harass people or worse for taking out a camera and recording. And as we've talked about, in many cases, it's the bystander video that has been more effective than police videos in providing accountability. And to Jeremy's question, I think that the answer is no. I mean, cameras are not, I don't know if they're the best tool for accountability, but I think that they're definitely not the best way to improve policing in America. But the question is, are we better with cameras than without them? That's in some ways a harder question. And that's the question that we're struggling with and that we're ambivalent about. And the cameras are happening. It's a wave. The police departments are adopting them. And we are saying if you're going to adopt them, we're going to oppose them unless they're done with good policies that make sure that they do serve as a tool for accountability.
Any additional questions? Sir in the back, and then we'll take this gentleman in the front after that.
Hi, I'm Alex Leal. I work for the NAACP. I want to ask a question regarding the feasibility or what you guys thought about gun-mounted cameras or taser-mounted cameras, because there's a fear that if an officer shoots that way and the camera's on his chest and it's facing that way, that cameras won't record gun-related, violence incidents, which they were, intended to record.
I don't see any downside to gun-mounted cameras. I think that when an officer's gun is out, that's already a situation that needs to be recorded. And in many ways, the gun-mounted cameras would have many fewer of the downsides that body-worn cameras have because they're not going to be recording most situations.
And then this gentleman in the front with the tie.
Hi, Jake LaPeroux, Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm curious for your feedback on use of body cameras in situations involving protests, demonstrations, other First Amendment-related activities. On the one hand, that creates a higher level of sensitivity about recording individuals engaged in that. On the other hand, there's greater potential for abuse. And I think we've seen a lot of instances in the last few years, whether it be Ferguson or Occupy protests, where having video of attempts to clamp down on demonstrators have helped stop protests from being shut down or otherwise suppressed.
This is interesting, in DC especially. So there's a pilot program right now in DC on body cameras. There's a policy for the pilot program. And one of the things the policy speaks to is basically body camera recordings of First Amendment, I don't remember what the exact name was, First Amendment activities, First Amendment events, something like that. So the idea is obviously protests, things like that. And the language that's specifically written in is that video from those recordings will be kept for longer, will be kept for 3 years, which is much longer than the standard retention period that the policy otherwise has. And I think, although it doesn't say specifically, I think that's coming out of the mass arrest from, I think, 2000, from the inauguration from 2002, and this concern that there was major suppression of First Amendment rights. And so there's really sort of this extra sensitivity. Obviously, then what it creates is that you, in fact, do have videos depicting people exercising their First Amendment rights that are then kept for much longer. I mean, it could be either misused for various reasons or even just are available for, if there's hacking, whatever it is that these things are out there. One of the other things that we looked at when we were kind of doing this comparison of different policies across the country is to what extent do they speak to these First Amendment concerns? And it really varies whether they do. Is it a retention issue? Is it sort of a general, body cameras shouldn't be used to suppress exercise of First Amendment rights? I think it's a really important question, and I don't think that we know yet how it plays out. And I think exactly as you're identifying, there could be almost competing interests, or the same interest that in some ways could be vindicated in competing ways. One is to keep that footage for as little time as possible, and one is to keep it much longer to allow for some record and some accountability.
I think people experience it, obviously, as you know, in both as very chilling, no matter whether people are new to protest or have been around for a long time. And then, as someone who represented plaintiffs in the Republican National Convention case in New York City in 2004, I mean, we saw the importance of civilian video and organized civilian video collection, because it enabled us to sort of counter the limited perspective that would come out through the police captured video. So I think it just keeps coming back for me to larger policy questions about how things are policed, and then the importance actually of non-police video, more so than the importance of police video in some cases.
Any other additional questions? Got one more here in the front.
Hi, Cameron Cox from DC Safe. We're a victim rights advocacy organization, and I was just wondering, some of the research I did regarding the body-worn camera policies, a lot of it has been sold to police officers as an ability to assist in victimless prosecutions and things like that. I was wondering if you had any ideas as to good model policies or practices to both protect victim safety, victim privacy, and victim wishes regarding prosecutions and investigations?
I think I really worry, and I overheard some conversation about this before coming in, about the use of body-worn cameras for victimless prosecution. And I think it takes away autonomy from survivors of violence to make decisions about what kind of accountability they want, that are often informed very much on their own knowledge of what dangers that will pose to them in their lives, whether it's an economic loss of someone going to prison who they actually need to survive, or the potential retaliatory violence. I think if a body camera comes into a volatile situation and there isn't sort of clarity about how that goes down, the survivor of violence will likely bear the brunt of being like, and on top of that, you had them videotape me. Here's what's going to come to you for that. So I feel that this is one of the areas that feels most sensitive around figuring out consent, autonomy, and respect for survivor self-determination. And so I think that it's one area, like so many other law enforcement incentives that are sort of being advanced as kind of on the backs of survivors of violence, as like this is going to help us and help survivors of violence, that could actually have a lot of blowback and presents a significant amount of concern for me. And whether that's as someone who's long worked on violence against women and domestic violence, and as someone who more recently has been working around survivors of LGBT violence or anti-LGBT violence, I think people want as much control over prosecution of homophobic and transphobic violence as people do around prosecution of domestic violence, for many of the same reasons, around privacy, safety, and self-determination, and that no one is more aware of the consequences of different kinds of accountability than the survivors themselves, and so they need to be in charge.
Okay, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you all for being here.